In this video, we'll be taking a close look at the concept of URL mapping, which is part of the Knowledge Base Assistant feature in Document 360. URL mapping can enhance your in-app assistant by providing context-sensitive help to your customers. Let's look at a few practical use cases of URL mapping using Serverless 360, which is a SaaS application, and see how we can provide our users with contextual help depending on where they are within the application. Right now, I'm inside my Serverless 360 project. I've already configured the Knowledge Base Assistant, and if I click on the icon, I can navigate through the entire documentation for Serverless 360. For a first example, say that if a user goes into one of the business applications under Vehicle Management, I want to display an article regarding event grid topics, which is relevant to this page. In order to set this up, we'll need to make a note of the URL pattern. And back in Document 360, click on Add URL Mapping. Give it an appropriate name and enter the URL pattern here. Since we're only going to be displaying one article from the documentation, select the action as single. Then we can search through our project and add the relevant article and click Create. Now if we go back into Serverless 360 and navigate to Vehicle Management, a user clicking on the in-app help will get contextual information related to this section of the application. Another use case for URL mapping is to display a list of articles within the assistant. This time, let's go into Business Activity Monitoring, and here, we want to help users get more information about the different types of monitors available in Serverless 360. We'll copy the URL pattern, and in Document 360, create a new URL mapping. Since we want to show several articles, we'll set the action to List, and use the search function to add the articles. Now, any user who lands on the monitoring section in Serverless 360 and clicks on the assistant will get the relevant information quickly. URL mapping can also be configured to display a search bar with a custom placeholder to point end users in the right direction of what to search for. For this example, let's look at the Azure Documenter section and assume that based on the data we've gathered, we know that a lot of users who visit this page are looking for information on what this feature is all about. Let's configure our URL mapping by copying the URL pattern and adding a new URL mapping and entering the pattern here. This time, we'll set the action to search and enter Azure Documenter as a search term. Going back into Serverless 360, under Azure Documenter, if we click on the Knowledge Base Assistant, we'll see that the search term is already filled in and has picked up the relevant article from the knowledge base. Sometimes, we may just want to hide the Knowledge Base Assistant altogether. For instance, we may not want the assistant to show up if a user is anywhere in the Serverless 360 settings area. Again, we'll note the URL pattern and set up a new URL mapping with a suitable name. Paste the URL pattern and set the action to Hide. Once saved, the Knowledge Base Assistant will not be visible if a user is inside Settings. There are three types of parameters you can include in a Knowledge Base Assistant URL configuration: include path, include query, and include hash. Depending on your URL pattern, you may need to enable or disable these. To demonstrate this, assume I wanted to set up a URL mapping for any page with this in its URL pattern to point to an article on Azure Logic Apps. I can add one with only include query enabled and set the URL pattern here. Then I'll apply a single action to the article I want displayed. This same principle applies to the hash parameter as well. Now, if the user lands on a page with that particular URL pattern, they will find help regarding Logic Apps. Keep in mind that users can still search through the entire documentation at any point in time if they wanted to by clicking on Knowledge Base. In conclusion, URL mapping improves your Knowledge Base Assistant by putting the right information in front of your customers when they seek help. Taking the time to understand what your users may look for as they navigate your site or application, and setting up suitable URL mappings can greatly improve the user experience of any knowledge base.